Welcome everyone, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and that's going to be rappelling.
Time spent in preparation is always time well spent, often lives well saved, sometimes even the difference between success and failure.
Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for watching. Today's video is one I'm excited for, and it's going to be a very special one today. I'm out here in beautiful North Carolina, and I'm with a very good friend of mine. Now, he is also an expert in what we call rope work. So today we're going to be going over the basics of rappelling and all the equipment that you see behind me. Now, it goes without saying, this is not official training, so please, if you're brand new to this or even experienced, always seek training from a professional. So with that, we're going to be going over all the equipment, the basics, and how to set up a rappel. So let's get into it. Now guys, one thing that you've got to remember is that there are a million ways to do this. There's literally 1,000 ways to tie a knot and even more ways to hook up lines, and every situation is going to be different. So if you're an experienced climber or brand new to this, again, remember this video is going to be an introduction, but there are many ways we can branch off and grow from what you're going to see here today. What is the ultimate objective of climbing or rope work? It's to get from A to B, and oftentimes we use ropes to do that either safely or quickly. But again, remember, safety always comes first with this stuff, guys, and although speed may be tempting, especially when you're new to something, going slower when in doubt is always the way to do things. So guys, remember, everything you're going to see in this video is the fundamentals and essentially a starting point. There are 1,000 ways to do this and different techniques that people prefer, so see this as the basics. We're covering the fundamentals today, but as anything that we do in the field, it's going to be situational dependent also. So see it as a starting line, get your notepads out, and let's start by looking at some of the equipment and principles that you have to understand before we even get to the ropes. So the most foundational piece of equipment when it comes to climbing is, of course, rope. Rope has been around for thousands of years and it hasn't changed. But what has changed is the material science behind it. So let's talk about what type of rope you need and what you're looking for and the important aspects of this rope. Because after all, there's going to be a difference between what you get at Home Depot and this Black Diamond product here. When it comes to understanding rope, the fundamentals that we need to know are really important. So how do we break down our rope? Well, it's essentially put into two separate categories. Those are going to be static and dynamic. What's the difference? Well, even though we look at rope and it may seem like there's no movement and there's no play, there is play. And static and dynamic is what differentiates that. Simply put, static, there is no play. Dynamic, there's actually a stretch or a bungee type elasticity to it. So why is that important? Well, static rope is very important for when you're going down. So actions like rappelling. Dynamic rope we want when we're going up something. Why? Well, if we're going up something and if we fall, we want the rope to have a bungee action, otherwise we can risk injuring ourselves very seriously, including our spine. If that rope doesn't flex and if that energy isn't transferred into that flex, it's going to go directly into your body, which can lead to injury and death. What do experts recommend? Well, a lot of my mates that do this recommend that we always use dynamic rope. The reason is that we have the option to rappel with dynamic rope as well as ascend and climb. Now that we understand both static and dynamic rope, let's talk into the other specifications that you've got to consider when looking to purchase rope, or even if you've been handing it, the crucial things you have to understand. The first one is going to be the length. How long is that piece of rope? And that's obviously going to be determined by your environment and the mission that you have at hand. Next is going to be your diameter. This is how thick the rope is. And diameter is a direct correlation to oftentimes the rope's strength. And the strength is obviously how much force the rope can take before it breaks. One last important note when it comes to rope, guys, is going to be the weight. Now, diameter means higher strength, and it may seem safer, but oftentimes you've really got to understand your mission and what you'll be doing with it. There is a massive weight difference between these two pieces of rope, and modern rope is extremely strong and reliable. So if there's a smaller rope that you can go with to complete the mission and meets your and exceeds your strength requirements, there is no reason to beef up. That's something that we believe that beginners really screw up with, is they often carry the biggest, heaviest thing, when oftentimes we can stay light. Especially when doing a mission, when it's not like a rifle, we're not going to be using this all the time. It's going to be for a very specific purpose at a very specific point in time. Therefore, staying lightweight, flexible, and being able to carry this equipment is very key. So really consider the weight of this equipment when you bring it. Don't just go for the longest, biggest rope you can find. So the next piece of equipment that we need to understand after rope is going to be anchoring. So anchoring is essentially a principle. And what it means is that we have to secure that rope to a secure anchor point. After all, in your environment, there might not be a perfect tree, there might not be a perfect rock. And even if there is, we want to make sure that that rope stays intact. If we do anything to compromise that rope without a safe anchor, then we ultimately compromise ourselves and our lives. So let's go through some of the methods that we use or equipment that we use to create an anchor point. So our most basic type of anchoring equipment is going to be this, and this is our tubular nylon. Now its primary purpose is to be wrapped around a tree and used as a strap or anchor point. Second use, which is pretty cool, is you can actually spray the insides and it's actually a tube, and we can put our rope through that tube, and that's going to protect our rope from any chafing. Coming on from that, we have our cordelette. So our cordelette is not our rope. They're two completely different things. This is often weaker and not as thick. But what it does mean is that we can make multiple strands and ties around a point. And we can have that in different lengths and sizes, just like our climbing rope. Next is going to be our Dyneema, and our Dyneema is used for almost the same purpose as our tubular nylon. It's used as a strap or anchor point to strap around either rope, yourselves, or smaller items. Next up is going to be probably the most iconic piece of climbing gear, bar the rope, which is the humble carabiner. Now, I always loved playing with these as a kid. I thought they were the coolest thing, but we got to understand some things about them. So first off is going to be your types. We have here what's called a wire gate, which as you can see is spring loaded, and we have a screw gate, which locks and secures. Some crucial things when picking a carabiner is going to be, it's always a trade-off between the security of them and the weight. These are very quick to attach, but they're not very secure. Our screw gate carabiners are very secure, but they do weigh more. Now these are aluminium, steel, and titanium, so they are already really lightweight. So apart from the size, the other main factor is going to be our strength. Now on all the carabiners, we have markings indicated by arrows and the direction of the carabiner. This is in kilonewtons, and that tells you the weight or the tensile strength of these items. And that's really all there is to it. They're very simple, but they are one of the most crucial bits of equipment. So next up is going to be the probably most unassuming piece of equipment, and that's going to be our harness. Why is it unassuming and overlooked? Well, especially in the tactical community, we often think that we can get away without a harness, but that's really far from the truth. The harness is so important. Essentially, it is your anchor. It's what allows you to safely hook in and link to these systems of equipment. So without it, if you can't get down safely, what's the point in any of this? We oftentimes see what's called a rigger belt being used, or a harness made out of ropes or tubular nylon. And although that can be done, we won't be doing that in this video today, simply because it's not safe and it's not guaranteed. After all, a harness weighs nothing. It's lightweight, it's small, and it packs up. So why not have the proper equipment, especially if your mission or if your activity is really dependent on a rappel or a climb. So our last bit of equipment that we're going to be covering today are going to be what's called an ATC and an ATC guide. So I have a few in front of me here. What are they? Well, these strange looking things are what allows us to control our rappelling rope. Right here we have an ATC, and we put the rope through here, link it into a carabiner. We're going to go on to that later. And this one is an ATC guide. Now this does exactly what the ATC does, but it gives you more control. Not only does it guide the rope, but it allows you to also set up more anchor points and have more control. So if you had to go with any of them, I highly recommend getting the ATC guide, because although for a beginner it may seem overwhelming, it gives you that space to learn more and do more in the future. Now, one device we don't have here today, because we're not going to be covering it, is the figure 8. Now, the figure 8 is very popular in military circles, and it's often used for speed rappelling. We're not going to be covering that today because, quite frankly, the ability to control yourself and your weight with an ATC is very important. And the figure 8 is more of a military item that isn't really used in the civilian world and is, again, reserved for professionals, and in the hands of a novice can be extremely dangerous. Now, the one piece of equipment we don't have here with us today is going to be what's called the Super 8 or the Figure 8. Now, these devices are used for rappelling and oftentimes in military circles, but we're not going to use them today because we want to focus on one piece of equipment, which is going to be the ATC guide. Now, although you can use a Super 8 or a Figure 8, we don't advise it because you're essentially sacrificing safety for speed, and speed is why the military uses it. But like anything brand new, we want to make sure that safety is paramount. So although you may see the Figure 8 commonly in movies and pictures, especially uses as special forces, please focus on today's video, which is going to be understanding that ATC guide and the principles that you need to do all of these activities safely. Lastly, with our equipment is something that we should have on us anyways when we're outdoors, and that's going to be safety equipment. So of course we've got our helmets. Now, whether it's ballistic or bump, we're going to want to protect our noggin. So make sure that you've got a good helmet. This is an optional piece of equipment, but gloves are a good idea. Personally, I like to have gloves when I'm in the field. You guys see me wear them all the time, and that's because whether it's rope, brambles, or ticks or something, I just like to have my hands protected. Working with rope, we are at risk of rope burn. If you do stuff properly, you won't be, but rope is always just a good idea. So now that we understand all of the equipment involved, we now need to understand the forces involved. Now, this might seem like a science lesson, but guys, please watch this. This is hugely crucial and important. If you do not understand these basic principles, then you will get yourself seriously injured or killed. So as always, look for some mentorship or an expert to teach you these things. If you're doing this in a group of guys and you do not have someone who understands what we're going to go over, it can put yourself or your mate's lives at risk. So with that, let's get into it. What I have here in front of me is a demonstration of what we call links in a chain. So we have our anchor up here, our connecting carabiner, our main line, and the person or the harness and harness carabiner at this end. And as you can see, they're in one line. So let's talk about what these are and why they're important. So all of these items are rated to a certain what's called a kilonewton. Now, kilonewton is a measure of weight, and that is equal to 220 pounds. So for our example, we're going to have a 10 kilonewton anchor, 5 kilonewton carabiner, 20 kilonewton rope, and 26 kilonewton carabiner. Now, we may hook this up and we can say, okay, I've got a 26 kilonewton carabiner, a 20 kilonewton rope, I'm good to go. But that's far from the truth, because we want to think of this as links in a chain. Our weakest point is a 5 kilonewton carabiner, therefore that is the weakest point that we have. So it doesn't matter that our rope is extremely beefy. You may have brought the beefiest, biggest rope you can find. You might be connected to the 26 kilonewton carabiner. This is over 5,000 pounds of force that this can withstand. But if your carabiner up here is only 5 kilonewtons, then that is your weakest point. So now that we understand the links in the chain, let's understand how forces act upon them. So when we look at our carabiner, we need to understand that we have a force that is simple and linear in nature. It's pulling from one direction in the other. It's on essentially a flat plane. But when we climb, we're being dynamic, and then we can get what's called an inertial force. So how does inertia work? Well, for those of you who may not know, and again, this is crucial to understand, right now, if we have our rope and our climber at the bottom, if you weigh 200 pounds, there's going to be 200 pounds of force on this rope spread throughout it nice and evenly and on the anchor point. But that's in an ideal world. Even as I hold this, this is swinging, and with each swing, we're actually increasing the inertial force on this rope, which means that the rope has to have a higher tensile strength. So you might think, Echo Mike, my carabiner is rated to 5,000 pounds, but I only weigh 200. So why don't I save my money and get a 200-pound carabiner? Well, that's because if I were to put you on the end of this line and swing you, each swing is multiplying the forces on that rope. So at the highest point of the swing, with the most inertial force, you can end up weighing upwards of 1,000 pounds. 200 pounds yourself, you've got a pack, you've got equipment, 300 pounds, you add 2 or 3 mates, you're looking at some serious weight. And all of a sudden, 5,000 pounds under any sort of force doesn't seem that much. The other point where this may take place is in a fall. When we fall, you have a stress on the line, you've got that inertial force plus the force of gravity, and that's going to increase all of those forces acting on this equipment. So if you've got a weak link in the chain, then that is going to be your weak point. The other thing we need to understand is parallel to gravity. So gravity is on a flat plane. Anytime that we make a force go parallel to gravity, like an airplane flying through the sky or out here like this, we have the force of gravity acting always downwards in no other direction. So when we're repelling something, it's easier for us to be up and down as we won't be acting on these forces, but the second we add what's called a lateral force, we're putting more stress on everything. A good way to understand this would be if I hold out this rope and if I droop it in the middle, or if there was a weight pulling down on this, like so, that's going to be the weak point of the rope. So those are some really basic things that you need to understand. One more thing we can add when it comes to making an anchor point or strengthening something is redundancies. We always want to have redundancies. You now understand how these forces can be easily multiplied in any situation, so adding a redundancy is really important. If one of these chains does break, we need to have multiple ways that we can essentially save ourselves and ensure that we have those levels of safety when doing all this stuff. So don't think in terms of one anchor point, think in terms of 2 anchor points, and if one fails, how can we fix that? But that's going to be something we're going to go through and explain now, because that's a whole can of worms. All right, so now let's talk about redundancies. So we're going to be explaining that with this simple line and an anchor point. So let's pretend that we have 2 rocks or 2 trees. Our most basic anchor point is simply going to be anchoring this around like so, and that gives us our anchor point. But if I have 2 points, I might want to double up. So then what I'll do is I'll get my rope and we'll put it around like so. But the problem with this is if this line gets cut or compromised, or maybe it chafes on the rock, is not protected with our tubular nylon, or someone bad just wants to cut it, this entire thing can unravel and it's going to compromise us at the end of the line. So what can we do as a redundancy and safety to ensure that our 2 points are, again, equally spreading that load, which we talked about, but also won't be compromised? Well, that's when knots come in. So the simplest way to make this redundant is to tie a simple overhand knot in the line. So we're going to go ahead and do that between our 2 anchor points here. Tie a simple overhead knot, and now we're going to hook in our carabiner. So now we are again spreading that weight against 2 points, but if we have a failure in the rope or anchor and this fails, this will now swing out the way and be attached to our anchor point still. So we have the redundancy of now 2 points. Now the downside to this is, and as a general rule, if you tie a knot in your rope, your anchor points, then assume that your strength has just been lessened by 50%. So if this is a 22 kilonewton rope, you now have 11 kilonewtons left. What's cool though is because we've doubled up, we've actually just made this 44 kilonewtons because we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, when we talk about strength, it's a single strand can withstand 22 or 11 kilonewtons. So we've got 22, 22, 44. Down here we have 4 of them, so that's going to give us 44. If this is compromised and fails, then we are back to 22. But because of our physics lesson, if this swings out the way, we now have the forces of gravity and inertia acting on it. So is 22 enough? These are the questions of math that you need to do and figure out to be safe with your equipment. But this is a very basic introduction to how we can add redundancy to these systems. So let's talk about equalizing. So equalizing is essentially making sure that these lines have an equal amount of force between them. In the field, we don't always have the luxury of our anchor points being a perfect distance apart. So we have to make sure that these lines have the equal amount of tension. Now you'll see, in order for me to do that, it actually offsets our line. So depending on the direction of your rappel and the equalization of your anchor points is going to determine how you're going to run this line. So if I have 2 points that are far apart, but I want to rappel in this direction, I'm now going to have my short line and my long line creating that triangle in the direction of the rappel. Likely so, if we switch these around and I want to rappel in this direction towards the camera, what I can do is bring it towards you guys, and now you can see how this is offset. And this is called equalizing, because if any of these lines, for example, if we want to rappel in this direction but these aren't equal, what can happen is this, and you're going to have a loose line, and then you're going to have your line under tension, only giving you one redundancy essentially. So now that you guys understand all of the physics, principles, and equipment, the next stage is going to be, how do we actually put this stuff on? You've got it laid out in front of you. Well, we're going to demonstrate how we're actually going to gear up and put this on. So with that, the first item that you're going to have is going to be your harness. So starting with your harness, what we're looking for is, these are easier if you just loosen all the straps, guys. Don't try to pre-adjust this to yourself, it's not going to work. It's also going to be really helpful if you have hooks in your boots, because that's going to allow you to step through and into the harness, just like that. So it's not riding up on my trousers, they just go straight on like so. Now, I'm wearing a belt today, as you guys can see, and I'm going to ride this above my belt. Like so. The first thing I'm going to do is tighten up the front. I'm going to get that relatively snug, but not all the way tight, and then I can ride up and adjust the legs like so. And that's really all there is to it, guys. As with anything, just tuck everything away so everything's nice and neat. So now we're going to look at your ATC and your carabiner. So how do we hook these in? Well, on here we have our belay loop. This is where the carabiner is going to be going through. And with the carabiner, we want the gate facing away from your brake hand. So I'm right-handed, so this will be facing away. Next up is going to be our ATC. We have our teeth here. These are going to be facing towards me. So now we have what's called our personal anchor, and this is made up of these pieces of webbing, and this is essentially to hook ourselves to anything that we might deem. I might be walking near the edge, I might be wanting to hook a piece of equipment, or just for safety. So we're going to hook this through ourselves in a very secure position. So we have not our belay loop, but on the inside here we're going to do what's called a girth hitch. So I'm going to bring this through. Through the top one, and then I'm getting this nice and tight, so it's the first one here. And then this we can clip onto our gear loop back there. So guys, you can see one thing we did was we just used these loops to tie this up and out the way. As much gear as you can get out of the way while doing this. And this is our imaginary cliff where we're going to be doing this today. We're going to be going out and doing some more climbing, but you'll notice that we're away from the edge. Many climbers have been killed by gearing up near an edge. So if you can, gear up before you actually start doing this stuff or putting yourself into a compromised situation. So what we're going to be doing now is adding any bits of equipment that we need or we think we might need during the rappel. One cool method we can do to clean up everything is we can hold out our lines or ropes, and then we can hold them out and we simply just twist. And what this is doing is it's just keeping it nice and tidy for us. I then take the two ends, and I have two eyelets, grab my carabiner, and I can hook that on like so. And that just helps keep everything nice and clean and out the way. All right, so now what we're going to do is we've got a demonstration rope set up, and if this is my rappel line, how would I link this in. So we've got our ATC gate right in here. What we're going to do is the rope is doubled up and we have 2 lines, and we're then going to press this through like so, like that. Now that's through, we're going to grab our carabiner, we're going to put it through all the items and then secure it. Now you may wonder why we don't do one. We could do one if we wanted to, but we're not going to do that. It's always safer to have 2. You get more friction and it gives you a lot more control. One rope, it's very easy for you to get away from. So now that you guys understand how to use the ATC gate, how to hook up your carabiner, let's talk about how we're actually going to create an anchor point over here on our training post and what we're going to do to this rope to prep to actually do a rappel. So guys, now that we're all geared up, let's go into why we actually need to rappel. Well, essentially rappelling is to save time, but we might not always need to rappel. So how do we know that we need to? Well, if the route absolutely determines that we have to do a rappel, then we will, obviously, in that case. But simple scouting or looking around may mean that we may be able to walk. But it might take 12 hours to walk, in which case a 12-minute rappel will beat a 12-hour walk. So determine whether you have to rappel or not. But once you've decided that you have to rappel, that's when we're going to get into gear selection and route planning. So when it comes to route planning, one big consideration is going to be how far your rope can go. Obviously, that is the biggest limiting factor. So when you're looking at maps and you're planning your route, you've got to look and see how much rope you need. But if you don't have enough, that's okay. All it means is that you've got to plan multiple routes on the way down. But the worst case is you think it's 100 feet when in actual fact it's 130, 140. You get to the bottom and now you're like, well, I'm out of rope, and now you're stuck and have to wait for a rescue. It's near impossible to climb back up a rappel line, so make sure that you do your route planning correctly. So now that we've selected our point, we know our rope can reach and we know that we want to rappel down it. The next step is going to be to select an anchor point. The common terminology for this is going to be a BFT or BFR, standing for big fucking tree and big fucking rock. So once we've found those items, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that it's secure. So if we pretend that this is our tree and that this is our rock, we want to make sure that it's not rotten. We want good signs of good, strong, healthy roots. If it's a rock, you got to give it the shoulder nudge. Make sure that it's stable. If it isn't stable, then make sure that what below it is stable also. For example, a rock may look very secure, a tree may look secure, but then if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it may be on a surface that isn't secure. Remember, once we attach a line or a anchor to this, we're going to cause lots of energy, and that rope is going to find the path of least resistance. Especially on a rock, it's going to, inch down into those crevices. So make sure that that rock is really secure. All right, guys. So right here we've got our tree, and we're going to set up a basic anchor point. So we're going to be using our tubular nylon. So a few things to remember when setting up an anchor point is simply going to be, you want to get it around the base and as low as possible. But there might be a time where you have to go higher because you need this angle to clear a rock or a ledge or something. So right now we've got our tubular nylon around the tree. What we've done is we've tied what's called a water knot in here. Guys, you can Google how to do a, a water knot, but there we have it there. So what we're going to do is we've got 2 strands right here. We've essentially made a single band, and now we can hook in our carabiner. But 2 notes before we do that is, first of all, if there's friction or bark, we're going to have to equalize. Remember, we can't have any of this, can't have any of that. But because this is nice and smooth and round, this is going to equalize in whichever direction we point it. But we need to add our redundancy that we talked about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, I'm going to simply tie my overhand knot like so, and now I'm ready to clip in. So now we've added our redundancies, so if any of these are compromised, we are good to go and safe. Right, guys, so a golden rule is basically when we attach our carabiners, it's going to be screwed down so you don't screw up. So what does that mean? So basically we've got our carabiner right here, and you can see that this screw is going downward. So screw down so we don't screw up. And that's for safety reason. We've got gravity acting on this in case this rolls and comes loose. Screwing up would be like this, where we are now, if this is loose, we are now coming upward because gravity is pushing us down, which obviously means a loose open gate. What we can also do is we can double these up like so. So both of these are always in a downward direction, tightening like that. And that's how we're going to set up our anchor today. All right, so now what we're going to do is hook in our rope. Real simple. All we're going to do is just place this in, tighten it up, and then we're going to put this guy in here. Now you'll see this black mark on the rope, guys, and that is every rope from the factory is indicated that this is a center. Because we're using 2 lines to rappel today, we want the center point on here. But even if it was a single line, we'd still want that center on the carabiners. So a quick note on the center line, you'll notice this black mark, that's the center of the rope. So because we're doing a dual line rappel, we want the middle hooked up to our carabiners on our anchor point. If we're doing a single rope rappel, then we'll just be attaching one end to the anchor. All right guys, so now that we're getting really close to rappelling, before we inspect the edge, I'm not tied into anything, so we got to make sure that there's a safety line between us. We can either do that by linking into the rope or using our personal device that we talked about earlier. And we're going to connect this to our anchor point, and that's basically going to ensure that I can walk over here, inspect what I'm looking at, and I'm tethered and secure. All right guys, so now that we've inspected the edge and we're hooked up, there's one crucial thing that we have to do before we can rappel down. And that's going to be doing what's called tying a stopping knot into the end of the rope. What this means is that the rope is not going to come through here, and God forbid our rope doesn't reach the bottom. It means that the rope won't go through and will fall to our death. So we're going to tie stopper knots in, and then we can go ahead and throw that rope over the edge. So what we're going to do is we're going to tie our stopper knot at the end. We want a nice long tail. So we're going to go ahead and do what's called a fisherman's. So to do that, we're going to have our hand, our thumb, we're going to come around 1, 2, the tail is then going to go through like so. And the reason for that is we want it nice. We've got lots of room in case this comes loose and it can move. So, and what it's going to do again is if this comes through, it's going to stop us from falling. Now guys, I'll say I'm learning a lot of these knots, honestly relearning them, learning them for the first time, and my friend and I are having a conversation, and we were talking about how this is the stuff that's going to get you home. It's the not sexy stuff, you know, just sitting here, a beautiful view, and practicing all these skills. So I know everyone wants to get on the range and shoot and be a cool guy, but the truth is, it's land nav, it's survival, it's the skills that we show on this channel that really matter. So pulling the trigger is the easiest part. Alright guys, so now what we've done is we've flaked the rope, we've gotten rid of any knots, so it's going to fall nice. But before we can throw this over the edge, we've got to make sure that we first of all shout rope if we're not in a tactical environment, and we have to look over the edge. Again, we're hooked in nice and safe, and we're looking for anyone who may be climbing back up or any final obstacles that may impede this rappel. Rope! Alright guys, so now our rope's down there. First thing we're going to do is call weighting the rope. So we're going to get nice and tight like so. We're going to put tension under the line here. We're then going to do a final check of all the carabiners, lines, knots, and everything is good to go. Basic controls here. So I'm right-handed. The rope is going to be on my right-hand side. I'm going to be taking this and putting it around to my glute. My left hand is going to be on the rope, coming underneath like so. I don't want my hand super close because you can get caught or pinched. And when it comes to our controls, when I come out, this is going to be loosening the rope, and then when I come in, it's going to be my brake. So think of our brake as we're coming in with our hands, and then out and brake, out and brake, okay? So those are your basic controls, guys. Guys, so that was an exaggerated version of the controls. What that's actually going to look like is like this. So I've got my brake hand underneath and I've got my left hand under here, and what I'm going to be doing is micro feeding it like this, because if we come out all the way, it's going to give us a really exaggerated movement. And then to stop, I just grab the rope, bring it to the swell of my back, come out, and it's just small movements like that. Now guys, rappel as fast as you're comfortable with. That's really the key to this, is don't go super fast. The more you come all the way out, the quicker it's going to go. So just use your hands, and again, you're using those micro movements to come down like so. So guys, now we're here on the rappel. This version of the rappel does have one downside, and that's simply if I'm coming out here and if I, for whatever reason, let go, all the ropes are going to be loose. There is nothing stopping this line from coming out. And a lot of things could cause you to do that. You could get scared, nervous, a rock could hit you, you could see a massive spider on the side of a wall, any myriad of things. So if you let go, that rope is going. So let's talk about a braking device that will ensure that even when we're hands off, this rope is going to stop. All right guys, so this braking device is called an auto block. Now this is a type of friction hitch because it simply uses friction on the rope to grab it when we're hands off. So let's talk about how we're going to make that. So the first part of making the braking device is going to be, we're going to take our runner and we need an extension. So we're going to come through the harness here. We're going to come up like so. We're going to come around here like that. And we're going to tie a knot. We're going to tie a second knot up top. Like so. We're going to take our carabiner, we're going to put this in, and what this is going to do is create an extension like that. Alright, so now we're going to take our rope, we're going to feed this through. Like so. Now we're going to come over to my leg. You guys can see here I've got a carabiner linked in, and this is going to be our actual friction braking device. So we're going to take the rope on our right hand side, we're then going to place it over, and now we're going to tightly come around like so. The more of these little guys we can get in, the tighter it's going to be. That guy here. We're going to take this guy now, we're going to clip him in like so. Okay, so this is our braking device. So the way this works is we're going to lean back, I can be hands off, and it works with friction. So you can see before when I was hands free, it was falling right through, but now what's happening is this rope is actually grabbing the rope right here. All right, so if we want to obviously use this, what we do is we slide this down, and now we can feed it through, but if I let go, it's gonna catch. All right guys, so we're all hooked up now. We're gonna be practicing on this, very benign slope, but it's not about that. When you go out and practice this stuff, guys, you want to do it in an environment where you feel safe and there's no worry, there's no scare of heights, there's none of that. You're already learning and training with some very complex equipment, so we want to focus on this. I don't want to worry about what's behind me. I don't want to worry about where I'm stepping. So to start off, what we're going to do is we're going to get used to all the equipment. We're going to make sure that all this is under tension and good to start off. We're testing our auto brake, and guys, get used to what this equipment looks like, what it feels like, get used to the placement of everything, practice all of your hand work and how all the controls work. The next thing we're going to do is a nice wide stance, and we're simply going to be walking backwards down the hill. So again, to go, what we're going to do is nice wide stance. We got our brake hand behind the swell of our back and behind our arse there, and then we're taking this hand and we're simply bringing our brake rearward, and we're going through nice wide steps, testing that brake and getting comfortable and confident with the equipment. Another thing we can do is practice leaning back. Guys, when you go over the edge in a rappel, I like to get on my heels and I just practice this feeling of leaning back. It's very unnatural. So again, the more we can do this in a training environment, the better. A lot of people, when they go over the edge, they like to do this, and that's just gonna face plant and you're gonna hit your head. So guys, when you're training this stuff, get comfortable. There's no issue with starting off slow. That's really the way that you get good and you get fast. So just getting comfortable with the equipment, working your way down, taking that brake off, feeding the rope is really key to that. All right guys, so now that we've done some training, we've gone over the gear, the principles, and we're comfortable, we're gonna now go out into the field and do this for real. So that's give you an intro of what you can actually accomplish. So with that, let's go out into the field, hit the rocks, and have some fun. We're out here in the field off the edge of this cliff. We're going to demonstrate a real rappel now. But before we do, let's talk about a quick setup that we've done and the safety line that I'm currently attached to. So what we've done, because this isn't a perfect cliff face, and in real life you're not going to have an ideal situation, so you've got to make the most of it. Just like the principles that we talked about in the classroom, we've hooked this up to one main tree and a safety tree, also using our nylon. With that, we're inspecting the cliff also, and I'm hooked up to a safety device. This isn't what I'm going to be rappelling off of. I'll be using this rope in a moment. But whenever approaching that ledge, especially out here in the field, you've got to make sure that you're attached to some sort of safety device. Now, with that said, today I'm out here with a good friend of mine who's highly trained in all of this. Now, as we were hiking up here, he did tell me that he has lost a friend going over the edge. So one triple fall can mean your life. That's why it's so important to make sure that you're anchored in and with a professional. So before we throw the rope over, we're gonna shout rope, and that's because today we're out here training and there could be people below, so we want to make sure that anyone at the bottom knows that there's a falling object coming their way. What we're gonna do is we're gonna throw this in the direction that we're going to be rappelling. Rope! Guys, there you have it. That was a very basic introduction to the skill of rappelling. Now, as always, please talk to a professional before attempting this yourself. Today was a ton of fun, and I cannot thank my friend enough for sharing these skills and taking me out here today. Guys, as always, look after your mates, look after each other, and closing thoughts for today, trust your equipment.